Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bowery Boys, Adventures in Old New York, an unconventional exploration of Manhattan's historic neighborhoods, secret spots, and colorful characters. By Greg Young and Tom Meyers. Narrated by L.J. Ganser. Introduction. Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not. By Greg Young. The scene, Strauss Square, specifically the top-floor apartment of a somewhat shabby tenement building on the square's northwest corner. It was here, on a rather hot evening in 2007, that Tom Meyers and I, good friends for many years, drank a bit of wine, opened up my new laptop, plugged in a karaoke microphone, and started recording a podcast on a whim. That is obviously not the most remarkable thing about Strauss Square. Strauss Square is an irregular plaza on the Lower East Side, formed by the collision of 5 streets at the southwest corner of Seward Park. The intersection they form is named for Nathan Strauss, 1848 to 1931, the German Jewish merchant king who launched Macy's department store with his brother Isidore. When Isidore died on the Titanic in 1912, Nathan got in touch with his Jewish roots, handing over most of his fortune to the cause of creating a Jewish state. Even that is not the most remarkable thing about Strauss Square. In the 19th century, Strauss Square was referred to informally as Tweed Plaza, named for the most famously corrupt character in the city's history, William Boss Tweed. Born down at 1 Cherry Street in 1823 to a Scottish chairmaker, Tweed mastered the shady and labyrinthine world of New York politics and became a savior to the impoverished residents of the Lower East Side, all the while padding both his pockets and those of his cronies with robust kickbacks and bribes. In 1870, on the eve of Tweed's downfall, supporters conspired to erect a statue on this very spot to honor their besieged hero. They hoped to make something that would accentuate his marvelous girth so that future generations of birds would have ample room to nest. The statue was never built, of course, and Tweed was soon locked up at the Ludlow Street Jail just 3 blocks north. But the name Tweed Plaza lingered around for decades, not unlike a whiff of one of Tweed's cigars. On the southern side of Strauss Square is the gentlemanly Forward Building, a slab of frosted architectural might, the headquarters, from 1912 to 1972, of the influential Jewish Daily Forward. Today it's luxury condos, of course. Next door to the Forward is the still festive 169 bar, with its colorful vintage sign. The tavern has served booze off and on since 1916, and was nicknamed the Bloody Bucket in the 1950s, for reasons that we fear were probably quite literal. Across the street inside Seward Park, opened in 1903, and one of the first public playgrounds in America, sits the magnificent Seward Park Library, a vital educational outlet for an overcrowded immigrant neighborhood, when it opened its doors in 1909, thanks to funding from Andrew Carnegie. It sits back in the park like an antique trophy, the most decorative structure in Nathan's Square. Strauss and Tweed and Carnegie and Jewish culture and hipster bars. I bring them up to illustrate what it takes to make a place. An overlapping cast of characters, many unknown to each other, striving to make the world great, or maybe just to finish the day with a little change in their pocket. Pick a corner, and you'll find 1,000 people from history standing there. Jewish newsies, seamstresses, tired cabbies, tourists, men with iPods. Strauss Square is remarkable because it has collected those stories and preserved them in architecture and street names, from manhole covers to rooftop water towers. History here is active and alive. And it was here, in 2007, pretty much oblivious to many of those forces, that the Bowery Boys' New York City History podcast was born. The audio history of everything. A podcast is a curious, intangible thing, a specialized take on a radio show and captured like a lightning bug in a jar. Given the endless length of digital airspace, independent podcasters have the power to change the world, to have their bite-sized manifestos spread all over the planet, delivered instantaneously and more pervasively than a radio or television signal. But changing the world is hard work, so most of us choose a more modest scope of subjects for our podcasts, like discussing sports, or knitting, or episodes of The Walking Dead. The podcast format was still very new in 2007. Only about 6,000 existed at the time. Today, there are a great many podcasts, approximately a Googleplex, approaching a near infinite stream of people talking about things that interest them. Due to the relative ease of podcasting, Tom and I decided that tipsy June evening to add to the number of podcasts, determining quickly that ours should be something about New York City. Although both of us were born outside Manhattan, Tom in northern Ohio, me in southwest Missouri, we had become very distinct products of New York by that time, shaped by its buildings and rattling subway cars. Some might have even called us New Yorkers. The first episode of our writhing little newborn of a podcast was devoted to Canal Street and Collect Pond. The latter was a source of fresh water in the 18th century that became so foul with industrial waste that it had to be drained into Manhattan's two rivers in the early 19th century, via canals, giving us the name of today's Canal Street. That's right, we couldn't just begin our show talking about the Statue of Liberty. No, give us toxic water. By the second show, we had found our official name, the Bowery Boys, named for a set of dapper 1850s thugs who styled their hair with soap and terrorized Irish neighborhoods while looking generally very foppish. The actual Bowery, its southern portion now packed with Chinese-language awnings and worn-out jewelry stores, sat just a few blocks west of us. Each time we sat down to record, we became lost in a city of rich characters and surprises, with each story taking a different turn on the kaleidoscope, from the tri-cornered silhouette of the Revolutionary War to the crackling crimson terror of the Great Fire of 1835, the glitz of the Chrysler Building and the majestic permanence of Greenwood Cemetery, the Flatiron, the Woolworth, Trinity Church, and Old Penn Station, Astor's and Vanderbilt's, Olmsted and Vaux, Studio 54 and Saks Fifth Avenue, and Robert Moses, of course, the 20th Century Parks Commissioner who dreamed up great urban solutions, bridges, and parkways, while inflicting more urban collateral damage than a multitude of King Kongs. In our podcast, we tackle these subjects and more, conversing as though hanging out at a bar or all-night diner, perhaps Edward Hopper's imaginary late-night cafe in Nighthawks, or McSorley's old alehouse on a slow day, or, most likely, I'm afraid, that swanky new craft cocktail bar that just opened on the corner. In reality, a live bar-corner conversation of such intensity and spittle would probably drive other customers from said bar and lead to its closure. As our listenership grew, we quickly discovered that it wasn't just New Yorkers tuning in, but also countless others who had fallen in love with the city in a myriad of ways, through vacations, school trips, movies, daydreams, photos. New York City's history was really everyone's to enjoy. Histori and you. Walking through the city, history isn't experienced in chronological order. New skyscrapers stand next to century-old concert halls. Colonial-era farmhouses nestle in the shadows of 1960s housing projects. Neighborhoods that once provided inexpensive first homes to new immigrants are now overwhelmed by trendy nightclubs and artisan wine bars. Times Square looks like a scene from Blade Runner now, yet it contains some of the oldest operating theaters in America. Outlandishly priced Fifth Avenue boutiques reside inside the very mansions of those who might have shopped there 100 years ago. Anyone who is or becomes a New Yorker interacts with the ragged fabric of its history, whether they like it or not. We're affected by the decisions made by people long dead, live in spaces other people built, walk down sidewalks, and travel through tunnels that someone long ago decided should be put right at that precise spot, and not, for instance, over there. Many people never give the name John Randall, Jr. much thought, but he was the surveyor of New York's visionary grid plan, and the reason it's so difficult to get a crosstown cab to move faster than 5 miles per hour. For many, the Empire State Building is the symbol of the city and its most photogenic building. Why does it sit right there? Because the Astors, a bickering and ludicrously wealthy family, built dueling hotels on that block at the peak of the Gilded Age. The original Waldorf Astoria that came to be considered outmoded when the skyscraper boom arrived in Midtown in the 1920s. The aforementioned Robert Moses, builder of highways and parks, destroyer of small worlds, made countless decisions that still affect the daily lives of New Yorkers. But New York keeps changing, keeps rising, so New Yorkers don't experience their city's history in an easily digestible fashion. Often they don't experience it at all, as the speed and intensity of city life turn it into one big blur. But behind those walls, and under our heels, whether they be Adidas or Manolo Blahnik, lives Old New York. What is Old New York? There has always been a somewhat vague and romantic notion of New York's past. Even people from the period we might today call Old New York harkened back to the Founding Fathers, or even back to the old Dutch families of New Amsterdam. The New Yorker, to whom the great structures have ceased to be novelties, looks with equal interest on the few architectural relics of the past, the old-time modest houses which still remain on the modern thoroughfares, said one newspaper in 1902, the same year the Flatiron Building, probably the most romantic building in New York, opened. In 1926, the Museum of the City of New York presented a runaway smash exhibition called Old New York, which attracted thousands to its old quilts and daguerreotypes of famous opera singers. When history-gazing was more of a casual, parasol-twirling affair, looking for Old New York may have required something of a selective memory. How fond could one be of an old building that could remind us of slavery, of racism and riot, of the subjugation of women, of disease, or of corruption? Today, we make an effort to remember both sides of history, the darkness and the light, making the buildings that survive today more than just landmarks. They're a profound link to past struggles. Nostalgia for pretty much anything can be found on the streets of New York today. Retro video arcades, bars with disco and punk nights, swing dancing lessons, Bushwick dandies with straw hats, soda fountains with $15 egg creams. Prices, of course, are almost never throwbacks. But nostalgia is not really history. It's selective remembering, a sentimental coloring of the past. While it's certainly present in this book, we hope we've kept it in check. We're visiting memorials, sites of tragedy and disasters. How nostalgic can one get for the good old days when the city was overcome with yellow fever? Not very. So, what is Old New York? For this book, we've loosely defined it as the pre-1898 border of New York City, which was Manhattan Island. Obviously, history runs just as deep in the other 4 boroughs. Take Brooklyn, which contains, of note, one of the oldest homes in America, the Wyckoff House of Canarsie, dating to the 1650s, not to mention the fine homes of Brooklyn Heights. Staten Island, or Richmond, if we're being accurate, has Fort Wadsworth and the Conference House and all of historic Richmond Town. Queens has the relics of Steinway and Jamaica. The Bronx has hints of its Dutch past in its very name. But it's in Manhattan that the past is at its most concentrated, especially around iconic spots that have changed American history. Wall Street, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Bowery, Central Park, Fifth Avenue, Times Square, Harlem. Through the efforts of New York City's Landmark Preservation Commission, building off the momentum of past preservationists, and a million happy accidents of survival, history lines nearly every street in Manhattan. The sites mentioned in this book are mostly from the pre-1898 years, expanded to encompass the Gilded Age period that stretched into the 1920s. In some cases, we simply couldn't ignore significant stories from the recent past. A single block, after all, can tell a multitude of stories. The adventure begins. Before you is a story of New York City, told from tip to top, neighborhood by neighborhood, and point to point. It's a historical treasure hunt, in which the prize at the end, if we do our job right, is a better connection with the thousands of people who have walked these streets before you. The good news is, you can start at the beginning and explore the entire length of Manhattan, from the islands of New York Harbor to the northernmost point. Or you can come up with your own path. These adventures of old New York are divided into neighborhoods. Many of these designations trace back to original Dutch or British names: Harlem, Murray Hill. Others have modern portmanteaus, created to bolster real estate values: Soho, Tribeca. Each chapter begins with a brief overview of a neighborhood's history called Situate the Listener, playing off a regular feature in our podcasts. Following that is a history of the neighborhood told through the perspective of several places, streets, and objects. We focus on a few less obvious sites or on the surprising details of the more iconic landmarks. You will hear a host of unusual themes and exquisite quirks rise from the hundreds of points of interest covered in the book. We hope a new New York City emerges in the search for the old one, a city of cat and owl statues, medieval and Egyptian carvings, strange signs, fairy tale corners and alleyways, hints of Freemasonry, various places George Washington slept, mysterious obelisks, and everywhere secret cemeteries. So, welcome to this unique Bowery Boys adventure. We hope that you enjoy the journey and that you find a rich new world of characters and experiences at spots around town that you might think you already know. And we have one small piece of advice. Stick with the book for a while, but then just get lost. Beneath this little scavenger hunt through history awaits another, one that you'll find on your own, with all its surprises and joys provided by the millions of New Yorkers before us who already forged their own adventures. But first, start with this. A short history of Manhattan. The Lenape Indians called this canoe-shaped island Mannahatta, a modest slip of a thing next to larger Soamhaka, Long Island, but rich with natural life from its southern marshes to its northern heights. The end of their dominion over the island was nigh the moment scouts sighted English explorer Henry Hudson and his halve mine sail into the harbor. Hudson worked for the Dutch, and by 1625 the Dutch West India Company had founded a settlement at the southernmost tip. New Amsterdam, as it was called, was a chaotic and often dissolute place, even after 1647, when stern Director General Peter Stuyvesant enforced a semblance of governance and security. When the Dutch were unceremoniously booted from their settlement by invading British forces in 1664, Stuyvesant chose to stay put in America, as did many Dutch. For more than 100 years, England monitored their distant holding, now renamed, like the entire colony, New York, via appointed governors and the oversight of its Trinity Church, chartered in 1697. But colonial Americans united against vast English injustices, eventually inciting rebellion. When representatives voted in Philadelphia on July 2, 1776, to declare their independence from England, General George Washington amassed an army in New York. He and the Continental Army were no match for the massive British troops, and for the entire duration of the Revolutionary War, the British held the city and based themselves here until their expulsion in November 1783, Evacuation Day. Until the early 19th century, the city of New York was geographically limited to the bottom fifth of Manhattan Island, but the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 encouraged northward expansion, stamping a grid of streets and avenues onto most of the undeveloped island. And just in the nick of time, too, for waves of immigrants, first Irish and German, then Eastern European and Italian, began landing on the city's shore in the 1830s, and didn't abate for nearly a century. They brought a rush of new languages, cultures, and cuisines, turning the city into a crowded and exciting metropolis. Transportation advancements, especially the railroad, made travel to the city easier, although the dominant method of street transportation inside New York would remain horse-drawn varieties into the 20th century. In the late 19th century, a manufacturing and trading boom and the development of a new financial economy helped create a society of millionaires, mere blocks from the most ramshackle of tenements. The unhygienic accommodations of so many people in such tight quarters prompted the construction of the Croton Aqueduct, an elaborate water delivery system, and the planting of massive Central Park, which wasn't originally part of the grid plan. Local authorities attempted improvements by forming city police and fire departments, and by establishing sanitation and social services. However, these were often infiltrated by corrupt political machines, such as Tammany Hall, who lined their pockets at the public's expense. New Yorkers were not of one mind during the Civil War. Violent riots in the summer of 1863 almost destroyed the city, pitting Irish against blacks, Southern sympathizers against Lincoln supporters. Neighborhoods such as Five Points and the Tenderloin seethed with vice and gang activity. Often the only recourse was wholesale demolition, couched conveniently in terms of colossal city projects, such as the Brooklyn Bridge and New York's Civic Center, and later the construction of the Lincoln Tunnel. As the city moved northward, the upper classes tracked up Fifth Avenue, while the entertainment district headed up Broadway to Longacre Square, renamed in 1904 after its newest tenant, the New York Times. Meanwhile, across the East River sat America's third biggest city, Brooklyn, sharing resources and sometimes competing for resources with Manhattan. In 1898, it begrudgingly entered the fold of Greater New York, alongside the Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island. Most of these disparate neighborhoods were soon connected by a series of underground subways, which linked the five boroughs with ferries and elevated railroads. The trains of Grand Central, previously hampering the growth of Upper Manhattan, caused a development boom when Manhattan, literally, covered its tracks, creating miles of new real estate and a new thoroughfare, Park Avenue, mere blocks from where the Fifth Avenue elites had already settled. Farther north, New York's African-American community, seeking refuge from tense conflicts in Hell's Kitchen and other neighborhoods, resettled into the old Dutch village of Harlem, building America's most important black neighborhood. Advancements in construction were creating a skyline downtown of marvelous stone and steel towers, lifted by new elevators and twinkling at night with electric lights. Manhattan was the crucible for reform movements, many conceived in the wake of horrific tragedies, like the General Slocum disaster and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Prohibition was also considered a reform, but it mostly fostered a not-so-clandestine network of speakeasies and an underworld of crime. The affluence of Wall Street kept New York roaring through the 1920s, until the stock market crashed in 1929, hurtling country and city alike into the dire straits of the Depression. Fortunately, massive projects, both private and public, kept many employed through the hard times, from the Empire State Building to Rockefeller Center. But the greatest engine of change belonged to something much tinier and four-wheeled, the automobile. City planners like Robert Moses, so influential in rebuilding city parks, pushed through the construction of driver-friendly bridges and roads, both inside and outside of New York, which made it easier than ever for middle-class residents to exit for the suburbs. New York's once thriving ports corroded with the rise of container shipping and interstate highway trucking. An elevated railroad linking West Side businesses arrived too late. New York in the late 1960s and 70s became a symbol of America's urban decay. It was out of money, weakened by failing infrastructure, and defined by many on the outside by its perceived debauchery. Its 42nd Street theaters, once showcases of mainstream entertainment, now flickered with pornography. Yet lower rents and laissez-faire attitudes also spurred artistic innovation, from CBGB to off-Broadway theater, energizing Manhattan's art scene. The cleanup of the 1990s saw crime rates drop dramatically and new construction projects rise, sending residential and business rents skyrocketing and causing distinct shifts in neighborhood demographics that threatened the city's cherished diversity. On September 11, 2001, when the World Trade Center was attacked and destroyed, the world turned again toward Manhattan. People were again reminded of its strength and vitality, of the city born almost 4 centuries earlier, just blocks from the WTC site. 15 years later, New York is again itself, at once its past and future. The New Colossus. Emma Lazarus wrote the poem The New Colossus in 1883 on a rather urgent mission. France had just given the United States an enormous gift called Liberty Enlightening the World, better known as the Statue of Liberty. The only hitch? It lacked a base to stand on. Through newspaper campaigns and fundraisers, such as the one at which an audience first heard Lazarus's poem, citizens eventually raised $270,000, enough money to fit Miss Liberty with a smart new pedestal designed by Richard Morris Hunt. 20 years after Lazarus wrote the poem, the verses were etched into bronze and placed onto a lower level of the pedestal. Her words have represented the voice of Lady Liberty ever since. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here, at our sea-washed, sunset gates, shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. "Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Chapter 1. New York Harbor. Situate the listener. New York Harbor. In 1609, Henry Hudson discovered what the Native Americans of the region had known for more than 6,000 years, the value of what would one day be called New York Harbor. Hudson was the talk of the town, or rather the wigwam. No European explorer had dared enter since Giovanni da Verrazzano briefly tipped his ship into the legendary Narrows in 1524. Hudson and the men of his vessel, the Halve Maen, were sailing on behalf of his employer, the Dutch East India Company. The harbor and the so-called North River, today renamed for Mr. Hudson, would prove vital to the success of that first Dutch settlement, New Amsterdam. 55 years after Hudson's journey, the more powerful British Crown would snatch up the territory from the Dutch, eager to control its valuable ports, prized network of waterways, and strategic position among its other North American colonies. Soon, this same harbor would help define the American dream and make New York one of the richest cities in the world. With the opening of the Erie Canal in the 1820s, connecting the Hudson River with the American inlands via the Great Lakes, New York Harbor became a gateway of domestic and international commerce and a symbol of American progress. Soon, something even bigger than trade was enriching New York's shores. It was here that millions of immigrants reached their new home, greeted after 1886 by a new beacon of opportunity and rebirth, the Statue of Liberty. Immigrants at Ellis Island gazed across the harbor to that astounding city of dreams and imagined possibilities they thought impossible in their home countries. America the Beautiful. Main article: Adventures on Governor's Island. Of the 3 small islands that sit in New York Harbor between Staten Island and Manhattan, 2 of them, Ellis Island and Liberty Island, have been embedded into the American consciousness as icons of freedom and opportunity. The third, Governor's Island, is often overlooked by both visitors and residents. However, for much of the city's history, this ice cream cone-shaped island, separated from Brooklyn by the richly named Buttermilk Channel, has been critically important to the nation's defense. Fortunately, its most treasured historical landmarks are still around more than 200 years after they were constructed. In 1624, when the Dutch brought the first...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?